Meet Professor Whiskers, and he's got a tail that'll make your fur stand on end. He's a financial analyst who spent years studying the greatest economic disaster of modern times. And today he's here to explain how a handful of clever cats saw what nobody else could see. The story of The Big Short, where a few sharp-eyed felines predicted the collapse of the entire housing market while everyone else was still chasing laser pointers. Now, before we dive into this financial thriller, let me be clear about something. This isn't just another movie review. What happened in 2008 was real, devastating, and it changed millions of lives forever. But understanding how it happened might just save you from making the same mistakes when managing your own finances. So settle into your favorite sunny spot, because we're about to unpack one of the most important financial lessons of our lifetime. The year was 2005, and the housing market was purring like a well-fed tabby. Everyone believed house prices would keep climbing forever. Banks were handing out mortgages like treats at dinner time, and nobody seemed to care if borrowers could actually afford their payments. But there was one cat who wasn't fooled by all the excitement. His name was Michael Burry, and he was about to make the biggest financial bet in history. Michael Burry wasn't your typical Wall Street fat cat. He was a former neurologist who had taught himself everything about finance and started his own hedge fund called Scion Capital. While other investors were content to follow the crowd, Burry spent his time digging through mountains of data, reading mortgage documents that would put most cats to sleep faster than a warm radiator. What he discovered made his tail twitch with concern. Burry realized that the housing market wasn't built on solid ground at all. It was built on something called subprime mortgages, which were essentially loans given to people who couldn't really afford them. These weren't your responsible homeowners who saved up for years and had steady jobs. These were borrowers with poor credit histories, low incomes, and sometimes no documentation of their ability to pay at all. Banks were literally giving out mortgages to anyone with a pulse, and then packaging these risky loans together into something called mortgage-backed securities. Here's where it gets really interesting. These mortgage-backed securities were like mystery boxes of financial risk. Banks would take hundreds or thousands of individual mortgages, bundle them together, and sell them to investors as supposedly safe investments. The rating agencies, which were supposed to evaluate how risky these investments were, kept stamping them with AAA ratings, the highest possible grade. It was like calling a bag of mixed treats premium gourmet food when half of them were actually expired. But Burry saw through the whole charade. He realized that when these subprime mortgages started defaulting, and they would start defaulting, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. The problem was that most of these mortgages had adjustable rates, meaning the monthly payments would increase dramatically after a few years. When that happened, borrowers who could barely afford the initial payments would be completely underwater. So Burry came up with a plan that seemed absolutely insane to everyone around him. He wanted to bet against the housing market by creating something called credit default swaps on mortgage-backed securities. Think of it like buying insurance on someone else's house, except you're betting that the house will burn down. If the mortgage-backed securities failed, Burry would make enormous profits. If they didn't, he'd lose everything. The banks thought Burry had lost his mind. They were more than happy to take his money and sell him these credit default swaps because they were absolutely convinced that housing prices would never fall nationwide. After all, that had never happened before in American history. They saw Burry as just another crazy cat throwing his money away on impossible bets. But Burry wasn't the only one who started to see the cracks in the system. Word of his analysis began to spread through certain corners of Wall Street, and other sharp financial minds started paying attention. One of them was Jared Vinette, a trader at Deutsche Bank who understood exactly what Burry was seeing. Vinette realized that if Burry was right, there was massive money to be made by betting against these toxic mortgage securities. Vinette became one of the first bankers to really grasp the implications of Burry's research. He saw that the entire mortgage industry had become a giant Ponzi scheme, where new loans were constantly needed to keep the system afloat. When those new loans stopped coming, or when existing borrowers started defaulting in large numbers, the whole thing would come crashing down. Through a misdirected phone call, Vinette's information reached Front Point Partners, a hedge fund run by Mark Baum. Now, Baum was already suspicious of banks and their business practices, having seen firsthand how they could destroy people's lives through predatory lending. When Vanette explained how mortgage-backed securities worked and how they were essentially ticking time bombs, Baum's ears perked up with interest. Vanette laid out the whole scheme in terms that even a kitten could understand. Banks were taking the worst possible mortgages, the ones most likely to default, and packaging them together with slightly better mortgages. Then they were slicing these packages into different tranches or layers, with the top layers getting paid first and the bottom layers taking losses first. The rating agencies were calling even the middle and upper tranches safe investments, when in reality they were built on a foundation of financial quicksand. The scale of this fraud was absolutely staggering. We're not talking about a few bad loans here and there. By 2006, the private label securities market had grown to over $1 trillion, with more than half of all mortgage securitizations coming from these risky subprime loans. The entire global financial system had become dependent on the continued flow of new mortgages, regardless of whether borrowers could actually afford them. And this is where our story really begins to heat up, because these weren't the only cats who were starting to smell something fishy in the housing market. Meanwhile, two young investors named Charlie Geller and Jamie Shipley were operating out of a garage in Berkeley, managing a small fund with big dreams and even bigger curiosity about market inefficiencies. These weren't your typical Wall Street power cats. They were scrappy, independent thinkers who had started their fund with just over $100,000 and were always looking for opportunities that others had missed. Geller and Shipley stumbled across Vanette's research through pure chance, like finding a hidden treat behind the refrigerator. They immediately recognized that if the housing market really was as unstable as these other investors claimed, this could be the opportunity of a lifetime. But they had a problem. Their small fund didn't have the credibility or connections to make the kind of massive bets that Burry and Baum were placing. That's when they reached out to Ben Rickard, a former Deutsche Bank trader who had retired early to grow his own vegetables and live a quieter life away from the chaos of Wall Street. Rickard was initially reluctant to get involved, having seen enough financial destruction to last several lifetimes. But when Geller and Shipley showed him the data, even he couldn't ignore what was staring them all in the face. Rickard agreed to help them navigate the complex world of credit default swaps, but he came with a warning that would prove prophetic. He reminded them that if they were right about this bet, it wouldn't just mean profits for them. It would mean economic devastation for millions of ordinary families who would lose their homes, their jobs, and their life savings. The weight of that reality hung over everything they did. As 2006 rolled into 2007, these investors found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Their bets against the housing market were costing them millions in monthly premiums, like paying insurance on a fire that seemed like it would never start. Their investors were growing restless, demanding explanations for why they were throwing money away on what appeared to be losing positions. The banks, meanwhile, were more convinced than ever that these cats had made terrible mistakes. Housing prices continued to climb, new mortgages kept flowing, and the mortgage-backed securities market showed no signs of slowing down. Bank executives were collecting massive bonuses, rating agencies were rubber-stamping more AAA ratings, and everyone seemed to be getting rich except the investors who were betting against it all. But underneath the surface, the cracks were starting to show. Mortgage delinquencies began ticking upward, particularly in areas like Florida, Nevada, and California, where housing prices had risen most dramatically. The adjustable rate mortgages that Burry had identified were beginning to reset to higher interest rates, and borrowers were discovering they couldn't afford the new payments. The first real sign of trouble came in early 2007 when several major mortgage lenders began announcing massive losses and filing for bankruptcy. New Century Financial, one of the largest subprime lenders in the country, collapsed entirely. AccuBank Mortgage also went under, and Fremont General Corporation was forced to stop making subprime loans altogether. These failures should have been warning bells loud enough to wake every sleeping cat in America. But instead of recognizing the danger, most of Wall Street dismissed these as isolated incidents. They argued that the mortgage market was simply going through a healthy correction, weeding out the weakest players while leaving the strong institutions untouched. Even as the evidence mounted, the broader financial community remained in denial. Major investment banks like Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and Merrill Lynch continued to hold massive positions in mortgage-backed securities. They had convinced themselves that these investments were not only safe, but essential to their business models. The fees from creating and trading these securities had become addictive, like catnip that kept them coming back for more despite the growing risks. The rating agencies, meanwhile, were facing their own conflicts of interest that prevented them from seeing clearly. They were being paid by the very banks whose securities they were supposed to evaluate objectively. This created a system where agencies had financial incentives to give favorable ratings, even when the underlying investments were becoming increasingly risky. As spring turned to summer in 2007, the investors who had bet against the housing market watched nervously as their positions continued to lose money. Burry faced angry calls from his investors who couldn't understand why he was persisting with what looked like a failed strategy. Baum's team at Front Point was also under pressure, with some questioning whether they had fundamentally misunderstood how the mortgage market worked. But then, like the first domino in a carefully arranged chain, the collapse finally began. In June 2007, Bear Stearns announced that 2 of its hedge funds that were heavily invested in subprime mortgages were in serious trouble. These funds had borrowed heavily to amplify their bets on mortgage-backed securities, and as the value of those securities began to fall, they faced massive margin calls. The Bear Stearns hedge fund collapse was the moment when the broader financial world began to realize that the mortgage crisis wasn't contained to a few small lenders. It was spreading into the heart of Wall Street itself, threatening institutions that had been considered absolutely rock solid. Suddenly, the cats who had been mocked for betting against the housing market didn't look quite so crazy anymore. As summer progressed, the crisis accelerated with frightening speed. More banks announced losses, credit markets began to freeze up, and the Federal Reserve was forced to intervene with emergency funding to keep the financial system functioning. The very mortgage-backed securities that had been rated AAA were now being marked down dramatically in value, sometimes to just pennies on the dollar. And that, fellow felines, is how a handful of sharp-eyed cats saw through the biggest financial scam of our time, while everyone else was mesmerized by the illusion of easy money. The lesson here isn't just about mortgage markets or credit default swaps. It's about the importance of doing your own research, questioning popular wisdom, and never assuming that just because everyone else is doing something, it must be safe. So the next time you're making financial decisions, remember Professor Whisker's advice. Always look beyond the shiny surface and examine what's really underneath. Thank you for watching, and keep those financial instincts sharp.